Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The twin paradox: why space travel keeps you young. Two twins stand together on Earth, both 20 years old, identical in age and appearance, and one twin boards a spaceship that accelerates to nearly the speed of light, travels to a distant star, turns around and returns to Earth, while the other twin stays home. And when the travelling twin steps off the spaceship, expecting to greet their sibling who is the same age, they discover something shocking. The twin who stayed on Earth has aged 40 years and is now 60 years old, while the travelling twin has aged only 10 years and is now 30. And this asymmetric aging is not science fiction, but a genuine prediction of Einstein's special relativity, confirmed by countless experiments with atomic clocks and particle accelerators. And yet it seems paradoxical, because relativity also says that motion is relative, that there is no absolute reference frame, that the travelling twin could equally well say they were at rest while Earth moved away and then returned, and by this reasoning the earthbound twin should be younger, and so both twins should expect the other to be younger. And this contradictory expectation is the twin paradox, a puzzle that has generated confusion and debate since Einstein first proposed special relativity in 1905. Imagine watching the travelling twins' journey from Earth. You see the spaceship accelerate to 80% of light speed, and time dilation occurs. A clock on the spaceship runs slower than clocks on Earth, ticking at 60% of the normal rate. And this is not an illusion or a trick of observation, but a genuine physical effect. Time itself passes more slowly for objects in motion, and so during the 10 years of ship time that the travelling twin experiences, 16 years pass on Earth, and when the ship turns around and returns, another 16 years pass on Earth, while only another 10 years pass on the ship, and the total is 40 years on Earth and 20 years on the ship. And the asymmetry is real. The travelling twin really has aged less. Their biological processes ran slower, their heartbeats were slower, their thoughts were slower. Everything about them unfolded in slow motion from Earth's perspective, though from their own perspective, nothing felt different. Time seemed to pass normally, but less of it passed. Now consider the situation from the travelling twins' perspective, and here is where the paradox seems to bite. Because from the ship's viewpoint, Earth is the object in motion. Earth accelerates away, then turns around and comes back, and by the symmetry of relativity, the travelling twin might expect Earth clocks to run slower, might expect the earthbound twin to age less, and yet the prediction is the opposite, and the resolution is that the situation is not actually symmetric. The travelling twin accelerates, feels forces, experiences changes in velocity, while the earthbound twin remains in an inertial reference frame, floating freely in space, not accelerating, and this asymmetry breaks the apparent symmetry of the situation. Special relativity applies only to inertial frames moving at constant velocity, and the travelling twins' frame is not inertial. They accelerate when leaving, accelerate when turning around, and accelerate when stopping back at Earth. And these accelerations make the travelling twins' frame fundamentally different from the earthbound twins' frame. And general relativity, which handles accelerated motion, confirms that the travelling twin ages less. The accelerations cause additional time dilation effects that accumulate during the turnaround, and the overall result is that the travelling twin is younger. Visualize the journey on a space-time diagram. With time running vertically and space running horizontally, the earthbound twin's world line is a straight vertical line, moving forward in time but not in space, while the travelling twin's world line is a bent path, going up and to the right as the ship travels away, then bending at the turnaround point, then going up and to the left as the ship returns. And the key insight is that in space-time, the proper time experienced by an observer, the time measured by their own clock, is the space-time interval along their world line. And this interval is maximized for straight paths and minimized for bent paths, exactly the opposite of spatial geometry, where straight lines are the shortest distance. And so the bent world line of the travelling twin corresponds to less elapsed time. They experience fewer years because their path through space-time is longer in space but shorter in time. And this is not a matter of perspective or coordinate choice, but a geometric fact about space-time, an invariant quantity that all observers agree on. The paradox has been tested experimentally, not with human twins but with atomic clocks in the Hafele-Keating experiment. In 1971, atomic clocks were flown around the world on commercial airliners and compared with clocks that remained on the ground, and the flying clocks showed less elapsed time, exactly as relativity predicted. The effect was tiny, measured in nanoseconds, because the planes were slow compared to light speed, but it was measurable and confirmed the theory, and similar experiments have been done with clocks on satellites, with GPS systems which must account for time dilation to function accurately, with particles in accelerators whose lifetimes are extended by time dilation. And in every case, the predictions of relativity are confirmed. Moving clocks run slow, and the effect is real and cumulative. The twin paradox also raises questions about space travel and the possibility of reaching distant stars. Because time dilation means that from the perspective of travellers on a fast spaceship, the journey to a star 10 light-years away need not take 10 years. If the ship travels at 99% of light speed, the travellers experience only about 1.5 years of travel time. The distance contracts in their frame. They see the universe compressed along the direction of motion, and they cross the 10 light-years in a fraction of the time it would take at lower speeds, and so interstellar travel is theoretically possible within human lifetimes, at least from the traveller's perspective. Though when they arrive home, they will find that decades or centuries have passed on Earth, their friends and family aged or dead, and this asymmetry, while not a logical contradiction, creates a deep emotional and philosophical tension. The travellers experience only a few years, but return to a world that has moved on without them. Some people respond to the twin paradox by rejecting relativity, by insisting that time is absolute, that both twins must age the same amount, that the theory must be wrong. But this response ignores the overwhelming experimental evidence, the thousands of confirmations in particle physics, astrophysics, and technology. The fact that relativity is one of the most thoroughly tested theories in all of science, and the predictions have never failed. And so the paradox is not a refutation of relativity, but a counterintuitive consequence that we must accept. And the strangeness of the result reflects the strangeness of the universe, the fact that time and space are intertwined, that time is not absolute but relative, that duration depends on motion, and that the universe operates according to rules that defy everyday intuition. The twins stand together again, one young and one old, and the younger twin has travelled through space and time, has experienced the compression of years into months, has returned to find the future arrived, and the paradox is resolved. There is no contradiction, only an asymmetry. The travelling twin accelerated, and the earthbound twin did not. And this difference explains everything, makes the situation non-symmetric, removes the paradox, and yet the strangeness remains. The fact that time is not fixed, that motion affects aging, that twins can end up different ages by taking different paths through space-time. And the twin paradox endures as a teaching tool, as an illustration of relativity's most counterintuitive predictions, as a thought experiment that has become reality through atomic clocks and particle decays, and as a reminder that the universe is stranger than common sense suggests, that time is not what we thought it was, and that the path you take through space-time determines how much time you experience, how much you age, how much life you live. And the travelling twin, younger by decades, stands as proof that Einstein was right, that time dilation is real, and that space travel, if we ever achieve the speeds required, will make astronauts into time travelers, moving forward into Earth's future while aging only slightly themselves. And the paradox, resolved but never fully domesticated, remains a monument to the weirdness of relativity and the malleability of time. Arrow's impossibility. Theorem why perfect democracy cannot exist. A political philosopher sits down to design the ideal voting system, the perfect way to aggregate individual preferences into collective decisions, and the goal is to create a method that is fair, that respects everyone's views, that produces coherent results. And the philosopher lists the properties that any good voting system should have. First, the system should satisfy unanimity. If everyone prefers option A to option B, then the group should prefer A to B. This seems minimal, seems obviously required. Second, the system should be non-dictatorial. No single person should determine the outcome regardless of what others want. Democracy requires that everyone's preferences count. Third, the system should satisfy independence of irrelevant alternatives. The group's preference between A and B should depend only on individuals' preferences between A and B, not on preferences involving other options. This prevents manipulation through introducing or removing irrelevant alternatives. And fourth, the system should produce transitive group preferences. If the group prefers A to B and B to C, then it should prefer A to C. This is basic rationality. And these four properties seem reasonable, seem like minimal requirements for a fair voting system. And yet Kenneth Arrow proved in 1951 that no voting system can satisfy all four simultaneously, that any system satisfying the first three must violate the fourth or be dictatorial. And this is Arrow's impossibility theorem, one of the most important results in social choice theory. A proof that perfect democracy is mathematically impossible, that any voting system must sacrifice some desirable property. Imagine trying to construct a voting system trying to satisfy all the conditions, and you begin with unanimity. You say that if everyone ranks A above B, then the system must rank A above B. And this seems obviously correct, seems like the least a voting system could do. And then you add non-dictatorship. You say that no single voter can determine the outcome regardless of others' preferences. And again, this seems essential to democracy, seems like the difference between democratic and authoritarian systems. And then you add independence of irrelevant alternatives. You say that the group ranking of A versus B should depend only on how individuals rank A versus B, and this prevents certain kinds of manipulation, prevents the outcome from being affected by adding or removing options that shouldn't matter. And finally, you want transitivity. You want the group preferences to be rational, to be coherent, to satisfy basic logic. And Arrow proves that you cannot have all four, that satisfying unanimity, non-dictatorship, and independence forces you to accept either intransitivity or dictatorship. And since dictatorship violates the second condition, you are left with intransitivity, the voting paradox, the possibility of cycles where A beats B, B beats C, and C beats A. The proof is technical, but the intuition is that independence of irrelevant alternatives is very demanding, requires that the group preference between any two options depend only on individual preferences between those two options, and this requirement, combined with unanimity and non-dictatorship, creates constraints that no voting system can satisfy while maintaining transitivity. And the impossibility is not a matter of not having found the right system, not a matter of needing to be more clever, but a matter of mathematical necessity, a proof that the requirements are logically incompatible, that any voting system that satisfies some requirements must violate others. Visualize the theorem as a set of constraints, four conditions that a voting system might satisfy, and the theorem proves that the four conditions form an inconsistent set, that no system can satisfy all four simultaneously, and this means designers of voting systems face a choice, must decide which conditions to relax, which properties to sacrifice, and different voting systems make different choices. Simple majority rule satisfies unanimity, non-dictatorship, and independence, but violates transitivity as shown by the voting paradox. Board account satisfies unanimity, non-dictatorship, and transitivity, but violates independence because the ranking of A versus B can change if a third option C is added or removed. And dictatorship satisfies unanimity, independence, and transitivity, but violates non-dictatorship. And no system satisfies all four. Arrow's theorem has profound implications for democratic theory, for the question of whether democracy can identify the will of the people, and the theorem suggests that there is no such thing as the will of the people, no unique collective preference that exists independent of the aggregation method used, and different methods produce different outcomes from the same individual preferences. And so the collective will is not discovered but created by the voting system. And democracy is not a matter of finding the true majority preference, but of choosing an aggregation procedure and accepting its results. And this choice is inherently political, inherently involves value judgments about which properties matter most, and there is no neutral or objective way to make this choice. The theorem also challenges the idea that voting is a purely technical matter, that once we agree on democratic principles, the implementation is straightforward. And Arrow shows that even agreeing on minimal principles, even accepting unanimity and non-dictatorship, does not determine a unique voting system, does not tell us how to aggregate preferences, and different systems satisfying the same basic principles can produce radically different outcomes. And this means that institutional design matters enormously, that the choice of voting system is consequential, and that democracy requires making difficult trade-offs between desirable properties that cannot all be achieved simultaneously. Some responses to Arrow's theorem deny the importance of independence of irrelevant alternatives, argue that this condition is too strong, that it is reasonable for group preferences between A and B to depend on what other options are available, and if we drop independence, then many voting systems become possible. Systems that satisfy unanimity, non-dictatorship, and transitivity. And board account is an example, and this response accepts that the group ranking of candidates can change when new candidates enter or exit. And while this seems counterintuitive, perhaps it is acceptable. Perhaps the relative evaluation of options does depend on the choice set, and this pragmatic response embraces one of the less intuitive implications, rather than treating the impossibility as a fatal problem. Another response focuses on restricted domains, argues that Arrow's theorem applies to all possible combinations of individual preferences, but real-world preferences are not arbitrary, are structured by ideology, by common interests, by shared values, and perhaps on realistic restricted domains, with preferences that are single-peaked or satisfy other regularity conditions. Voting systems can satisfy all of Arrow's conditions, and this response suggests that the impossibility is less severe in practice than in theory, that real politics involves preferences with structure that makes coherent aggregation possible. A third response embraces the impossibility, accepts that perfect democracy is unattainable, that all voting systems have flaws, and rather than searching for the ideal system, we should focus on systems that are good enough, that balance various desirable properties, that are transparent and legitimate, even if imperfect. And this response treats Arrow's theorem as a reality check, as a reminder that utopian political designs are impossible, that democracy is inherently messy and requires constant adjustment and compromise, and that the legitimacy of democratic systems comes not from their perfection, but from their procedures, from the fact that everyone has voice even if no one gets exactly what they want. The philosopher sits with a list of properties, recognizing that they cannot all be satisfied, that the perfect voting system does not exist, and the quest for ideal democracy confronts mathematical impossibility, confronts Arrow's proof that the properties we want cannot be combined, and the theorem stands, a monument to the limits of democratic design, a proof that politics is not a technical problem with technical solutions, but a domain where trade-offs are inevitable, where values conflict, where no system satisfies everyone's ideals, and Arrow's impossibility theorem remains one of the most important results in social science. A demonstration that even the most basic intuitions about fair voting are mutually incompatible, that democracy requires accepting imperfection, and that the design of institutions is a matter of choosing which imperfections to tolerate, which values to prioritize, and which trade-offs to make. And the impossibility endures, shaping debates about electoral systems, challenging naive faith in majority rule, and reminding us that perfect democracy is not just difficult, but impossible. Not just beyond current reach, but beyond any reach, mathematically proven to be unattainable. And the theorem persists as a permanent limitation on political possibility, a proof that we must live with flawed systems because perfect ones cannot exist. The voting paradox. When adding voters changes winners impossibly. An election occurs, 3 candidates compete, and voters rank the candidates according to their preferences, and the votes are counted, and candidate A wins, receives the most support, is the clear winner. And then more voters arrive, more ballots are cast, and these new voters all rank candidate A first, all prefer A to the other candidates, all support the winner, and the votes are recounted with the additional ballots, and candidate A loses, is no longer the winner, is defeated by candidate B or C, and this seems impossible, seems to violate basic logic, seems to contradict the meaning of support. Because how can receiving additional support cause a candidate to lose? How can gaining voters result in defeat? And yet this can happen under certain voting systems, under rank choice or instant runoff systems, where voters rank candidates and losers are eliminated in rounds. And the elimination order can change when new voters are added, can cause candidates who would have been eliminated early to survive, and candidates who would have won to be eliminated. And this is the voting paradox, the demonstration that voting systems can produce inconsistent results, can violate monotonicity, can make winners lose when they gain support. And the paradox reveals that translating individual preferences into collective choices is more complex than it seems, that no voting system is perfect, that all systems have problematic properties. And the voting paradox is one of many paradoxes that arise in social choice theory, in the study of how groups make decisions, and these paradoxes show that democratic decision-making faces inherent difficulties, faces impossibilities proven by mathematical theorems. And the voting paradox remains a challenge for democratic theory, forces recognition that institutional design matters, that different voting systems produce different outcomes from the same preferences, and that choosing a voting system requires trade-offs, requires accepting some problems to avoid others. Imagine a specific example with instant runoff voting. 3 candidates A, B, C, and initially 5 voters with preferences. 2 voters prefer A, then B, then C. 2 voters prefer B, then C, then A. And 1 voter prefers C, then B, then A. And in the first round, A receives 2 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated for having the fewest. And C's vote transfers to B, and B wins with 3 votes to A's 2. And now suppose 2 additional voters arrive, both ranking A first, ranking A, then C, then B, and now there are 7 voters. 4 prefer A first. And in the first round, A receives 4 first-place votes. B receives 2. C receives 1, so C is eliminated again, and C's vote plus the 2 new votes that ranked C second all transfer to B. Wait, let me recalculate. The 2 new voters ranked C second, so their votes would transfer to C if A were eliminated. But A has most first-place votes, so instead B is eliminated for having fewest, and B's votes transfer based on second preferences. The original two B voters had C second, so those transfer to C, and now C has 3 votes to A's 4. And A wins, so actually this example shows A winning both times. Let me construct a different example. Consider instead 3 candidates and a scenario where initial votes create a situation where candidate B wins after C is eliminated and C's supporters transfer to B. But when new voters arrive supporting A, this changes the elimination order such that B is eliminated first and B's supporters transfer to C, and C wins, defeating A despite A gaining support. And constructing specific examples requires careful attention to transfer patterns, to how second and third preferences interact with elimination orders. And the paradox is real, has been documented, has been proven possible under instant runoff and other systems. And the mathematical possibility demonstrates that monotonicity, the principle that gaining support cannot hurt a candidate, is not guaranteed by all voting systems, is violated by some systems, and this violation is paradoxical, is counterintuitive, seems to violate the meaning of winning. The voting paradox connects to Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable criteria, including monotonicity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and non-dictatorship, and the voting paradox is one manifestation of this impossibility, is one way that voting systems fail to satisfy all desirable properties. And Arrow's theorem shows that the paradox is not a defect of particular voting systems, but is an inherent feature of aggregating preferences. It is an unavoidable trade-off, and different voting systems make different trade-offs, prioritize different properties, and the paradox shows that monotonicity is one property that some systems sacrifice. And choosing a voting system requires deciding which properties are most important, which failures are most acceptable. Visualize the voting paradox as revealing path dependence, where the outcome depends not just on preferences but on the order in which candidates are eliminated, on the sequence of decisions, and adding voters changes. This sequence changes which candidates survive to later rounds. And this path dependence creates opportunities for paradoxes, creates situations where gaining support can hurt because it changes the path, changes who is eliminated when. And this shows that voting outcomes are not simply determined by preferences, but are mediated by procedures, by the specific rules used to aggregate preferences, and different rules produce different outcomes. One response to the voting paradox is to abandon instant runoff voting, to use systems that do not exhibit non-monotonicity and plurality voting, where the candidate with most first-place votes wins without elimination rounds, satisfies monotonicity. Gaining votes always helps under plurality, but plurality has other problems, has spoiler effects, can elect candidates opposed by majorities, and so while plurality avoids the voting paradox, it faces different paradoxes, different failures, and no system is paradox-free, and the choice is between different sets of problems. Another response is to accept that monotonicity, violations are rare, are unlikely in practice, require specific configurations of preferences, and while the voting paradox is possible, it is improbable, and instant runoff voting performs well on average. Despite theoretical problems, and empirical studies of actual elections using instant runoff find few, if any, cases of monotonicity violations, find that the paradox is more theoretical than practical, and this response prioritizes actual performance over theoretical properties, accepts that systems can be good enough even if not perfect. An instant runoff may be good enough despite the voting paradox. A third response develops approval voting or score voting systems where voters can express intensity of preference, can give multiple candidates approval or give candidates numerical scores. And these systems have different properties, avoid some paradoxes while potentially creating others. and approval voting satisfies monotonicity. Gaining approval always helps, but approval voting faces strategic voting problems. Voters must decide which candidates to approve. An optimal strategy depends on expectations about others' votes, and this strategic complexity is a different kind of problem, and no system eliminates all difficulties. The voting paradox also raises questions about the meaning of winning, about what it means for a candidate to have majority support, and the paradox shows that winning is system relative, is defined by the voting rules, and different rules define winning differently. And a candidate can be a winner under one system and a loser under another, even with the same preferences. And this challenges the idea that elections reveal a determinate will of the people, suggests that collective will is constructed by voting procedures rather than simply discovered, and different procedures construct different collective wills. And this has implications for democratic legitimacy, for understanding what elections achieve. And some argue that the paradox undermines electoral legitimacy, shows that election outcomes are arbitrary, are dependent on rules rather than reflecting genuine popular preferences, while others argue that the paradox shows only that rule choice matters, that democracy requires choosing rules wisely, but that elections can still be legitimate, even if different rules would produce different outcomes. The election is held, votes are counted, and candidate A wins, and more votes arrive supporting A, and votes are recounted, and A loses, and the paradox emerges, impossible but real, proven but counterintuitive, and the voting paradox stands as one of many paradoxes. In social choice theory, stands as evidence that aggregating preferences is complex, is not simply a matter of counting, but involves trade-offs, involves accepting some problems to avoid others. And the paradox shows that no voting system is perfect, that Arrow's impossibility theorem is not merely theoretical, but has practical manifestations, and the voting paradox remains relevant for democratic design, for choosing electoral systems, for understanding the limits of voting, and the paradox endures. The trolley problem: would you kill one person to save five? A runaway trolley speeds down a track, out of control, and ahead on the track, 5 people are tied up, unable to move, unaware of the approaching danger, and the trolley will kill them all unless something is done. And you stand next to a lever that controls a switch, and if you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track, and on that side track, 1 person is tied up, and pulling the lever will save the 5 people, but will kill the 1 person, and you have seconds to decide. And the question is asked: should you pull the lever? Should you actively cause 1 person's death to prevent 5 deaths? And this is the trolley problem, a thought experiment in ethics first formulated by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later refined by Judith Jarvis Thomson. And the problem has generated endless debate about the nature of moral responsibility, about the difference between killing and letting die, about whether the consequences of an action are all that matter, or whether the act itself has moral significance, independent of outcomes. Visualize the scenario: the track stretches ahead, the 5 people bound and helpless, the trolley barreling toward them, unstoppable, and you at the switch, hand on the lever, and time slows as you deliberate. If you do nothing, 5 people die. If you pull the lever, 1 person dies, and the arithmetic seems simple. 5 is greater than 1. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is a net gain. And by this consequentialist reasoning, you should pull the lever. You should minimize harm, maximize lives saved. And many people, when presented with this scenario, say they would pull the lever, would divert the trolley, would accept responsibility for causing 1 death to prevent 5. But now consider a variation, the Fat Man variant, also called the footbridge scenario, where you stand on a bridge above the tracks, and the trolley is approaching below, heading toward the 5 people, and next to you on the bridge stands a very large person, large enough that if pushed off the bridge, they would fall onto the tracks, and their body would stop the trolley, saving the 5 people, but killing the large person. And you could push this person, could use their body as an obstruction. And the outcome is the same as before. 5 people saved, 1 person killed. And yet when presented with this scenario, most people say they would not push, would not use the large person as a means to stop the trolley, even though the consequences are identical to the lever case. 5 saved, 1 killed. And this asymmetry, this difference in moral intuition between the 2 cases despite the same outcome, is what makes the trolley problem so philosophically interesting. It reveals that our moral judgments are not based purely on consequences, not purely on maximizing lives saved, but also on how those lives are saved, on whether the harm is direct or indirect, on whether someone is used as a means or merely affected as a side effect. The distinction involves the doctrine of double effect, a principle in ethics that says there is a moral difference between intending harm as a means to an end versus foreseeing harm as an unintended side effect. In the lever case, pulling the lever is intended to divert the trolley, and the death of the 1 person is a foreseen but unintended side effect. The 1 person dies because they happen to be on the diverted track, but their death is not the means by which the 5 are saved. The means is the diversion itself, whereas in the Fat Man case, pushing the person is intended precisely to use their body to stop the trolley. Their death is the means by which the 5 are saved, and this makes the act feel more like murder, more like using a person as a tool. And the doctrine of double effect says that intending harm as a means is morally worse than foreseeing harm as a side effect, even if the outcomes are identical. Critics argue that this distinction is spurious, that consequences are what matter, that if 5 lives are saved and 1 life is lost, the moral calculus is the same, regardless of how the result is achieved, and utilitarians, who judge actions by their consequences, say that both pulling the lever and pushing the large person are morally required if they maximize overall welfare, and any moral theory that forbids saving 5 lives to avoid directly causing 1 death is absurd, is giving too much weight to squeamishness or moral intuitions that evolved in contexts very different from modern ethical dilemmas. But defenders of deontological ethics, ethics based on duties and rules rather than consequences, argue that people have rights, that using someone as a means without their consent violates their dignity, that not all ways of achieving good outcomes are permissible, and that the Fat Man case is wrong precisely because it treats the large person as a mere tool, as an object to be sacrificed for the greater good. And this violates the Kantian principle that people are ends in themselves, never merely means. The trolley problem also raises questions about moral responsibility and causation, because in the lever case, you cause the death of the 1 person by pulling the lever, you redirect the trolley, but in the do-nothing case, you do not cause the death of the 5 people. The trolley causes their deaths, and you merely fail to prevent it. And some moral theories distinguish between killing and letting die, between acts and omissions, and say that killing is worse than letting die, that actively causing harm carries more moral weight than passively allowing harm. And by this reasoning, pulling the lever might be wrong because it involves killing, whereas doing nothing involves only letting die. But this asymmetry is controversial. Many philosophers argue that there is no deep moral difference between killing and letting die, that if you can prevent 5 deaths at the cost of 1 death, you should do so, regardless of whether the mechanism involves action or inaction. Visualize standing at the lever, frozen by indecision, the trolley approaching, the seconds ticking away, and your mind races through arguments, through principles, through gut reactions, and different moral frameworks give different answers. Consequentialism says pull, deontology says maybe not. Virtue ethics asks what a virtuous person would do, and the answer is not obvious, depends on which virtues are relevant: courage, compassion, respect for autonomy. And the problem reveals that our moral intuitions are not consistent, not unified by a single principle, but are a patchwork of different considerations, different values that sometimes conflict. And in hard cases like the trolley problem, these conflicts become explicit. become impossible to ignore, and we must choose which principle to prioritize, which value to uphold. And there is no algorithm, no formula that tells us the right answer, only judgment, only the difficult work of weighing competing considerations and making a choice we can live with. The trolley problem has been studied empirically. Psychologists have presented it to thousands of subjects, measuring their responses, looking for patterns, and the results confirm that most people distinguish between the lever and the fat man cases. Most would pull the lever, but not push the fat man. And brain imaging studies suggest that different parts of the brain are involved. The lever case activates regions associated with reasoning and calculation, while the fat man case activates regions associated with emotion and social cognition. And this suggests that our moral judgments involve both rational deliberation and emotional response, both utilitarian calculation and deontological intuition, and different scenarios trigger different systems. And the tension between these systems is what makes moral dilemmas difficult. What makes them dilemmas? Cases where no answer satisfies all our moral intuitions, where any choice involves sacrifice, involves accepting consequences or violating principles. And the trolley problem, artificial as it is, captures this structure, this irreducible difficulty that characterizes real moral life. The trolley speeds on, the people lie helpless, the lever waits, and the choice must be made, pull or don't pull, act or refrain, and the problem offers no comfort, no easy answer, only the recognition that morality is hard, that lives are at stake, that our choices matter, and that sometimes there is no right answer, only answers that feel less wrong. And the trolley problem endures, not because it resembles real dilemmas we face, but because it distills the structure of moral conflict, because it forces explicit the trade-offs we usually avoid, and because it reminds us that ethics is not a set of rules to be followed mechanically, but a practice requiring judgment, requiring courage, requiring the willingness to make difficult choices and accept responsibility for their consequences. And the trolley rolls, and the lever waits, and the question persists. The tragedy of the commons, why shared resources destroy themselves. A village shares a common pasture, open to all herders, and each herder can graze their animals freely, can use the resource without restriction, and each herder reasons individually, calculates privately that adding one more animal to their herd brings them full benefit, brings them more milk and meat and wealth, while the cost of overgrazing is shared among all herders, is distributed across the community, and so each herder gains fully from expansion but pays only a fraction of the cost. And this asymmetry, this structure of incentives, drives each rational herder to add more animals, to maximize their individual benefit. And every herder reasons this way. Every herder expands their herd, and the commons becomes overgrazed, becomes depleted, becomes destroyed. And what was a productive shared resource becomes barren, becomes useless to everyone. And this is the tragedy of the commons, described by Garrett Hardin in 1968. A pattern where individually rational decisions lead to collective disaster, where the pursuit of self-interest in using shared resources results in the destruction of those resources. And the tragedy applies not just to grazing pastures, but to fisheries that are overfished, to aquifers that are depleted, to atmospheres that are polluted, to any shared resource where individual benefits are private but costs are collective. And the tragedy reveals a fundamental problem in resource management, shows that voluntary restraint is insufficient, shows that without collective governance, shared resources tend toward destruction, and solving the tragedy requires institutions, requires mechanisms that align individual incentives with collective sustainability. Imagine the herder's calculation more precisely. The commons can sustain a certain number of animals, and beyond that capacity, the pasture degrades, produces less grass, supports fewer animals, and when operating below capacity, each additional animal brings net benefit to its owner without significant cost to others. But when operating at or above capacity, each additional animal brings benefit to its owner while imposing costs on all herders through degradation. And the individual herder receives the full benefit, receives all the milk and meat from their additional animal, but pays only their proportional share of the degradation cost. And if there are 10 herders, then each pays 1/10 of the degradation cost. And so the individual benefit exceeds the individual cost, even when the collective cost exceeds the collective benefit. And this creates the incentive structure that drives the tragedy, that makes it individually rational to add animals even when doing so harms the collective. And every herder faces this incentive. Every herder adds animals, and the commons collapses under the weight of rational individual decisions. The tragedy of the commons demonstrates the difference between individual and collective rationality, shows that actions can be rational from an individual perspective, while being disastrous from a collective perspective. And this divergence is the core of the tragedy, is what makes the situation tragic rather than merely unfortunate. And the tragedy is not caused by irrationality or malice, but by rational pursuit of self-interest, in a context where individual and collective interests misalign. And Hardin's insight was that this misalignment is structural, is inherent in the nature of common pool resources, and cannot be solved by appeals to conscience or voluntary restraint, because any individual who restrains themselves while others do not simply sacrifices their own benefit without saving the commons. And this creates a race to the bottom, creates pressure to exploit resources before others do, and the tragedy unfolds inevitably unless institutions intervene. Visualize the tragedy as a multiplayer prisoner's dilemma, where each individual faces the choice between restraint, limiting their use of the commons for collective benefit, or exploitation, maximizing their individual use at collective cost. And exploitation dominates restraint, because regardless of what others do, you are better off exploiting. If others restrain themselves, you benefit from the preserved commons while taking more than your share. And if others exploit, then the commons is doomed anyway, and restraint only makes you worse off relative to others. And so everyone exploits. Everyone takes more than sustainable, and the commons is destroyed. And this structure shows that the tragedy is a coordination problem, is a failure to achieve collective action, and solving it requires changing the incentive structure, requires making restraint individually rational. And this can be achieved through various mechanisms, through private property that internalizes costs, through regulation that enforces limits, through community management that creates monitoring and sanctions, through taxation that makes exploitation costly. One response to the tragedy is privatization, converting commons into private property, assigning ownership to individuals who then bear the full costs and benefits of their decisions. And private owners have incentive to manage sustainably, because degradation reduces the value of their property. And this aligns individual and collective interests, makes conservation individually rational. And historical examples exist of commons being enclosed, being divided into private parcels. And while enclosure solves the tragedy, it raises questions of justice, of how property is assigned, of what happens to those who lose access. And privatization is not always feasible, is not appropriate for all resources, and some commons, like the atmosphere or the ocean, cannot be easily privatized, cannot be divided into individual holdings, and alternative solutions are needed. Another response is regulation, government intervention that imposes limits on use, that enforces sustainable practices through monitoring and penalties, and regulation can solve the tragedy by making exploitation illegal, by removing the incentive to overuse, and examples include fishing quotas, emission limits, grazing restrictions, and regulations can be effective when enforcement is strong, when violations are detected and punished, but regulation faces challenges, requires accurate information about sustainable use levels, requires political will to enforce, requires resistance to lobbying from those who benefit from exploitation, and regulations can be captured, can be weakened or undermined. and the tragedy can re-emerge if enforcement fails. A third response, emphasized by Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for this work, is community management, where local communities develop institutions to govern commons, create rules for use, establish monitoring systems, sanction violators, and these community-managed commons can be sustainable for long periods, can avoid tragedy through social norms, through reputation mechanisms, through collective decision-making, and Ostrom documented many examples worldwide of successful commons management, showed that neither privatization nor government regulation is necessary, that communities can self-organize to solve tragedies, and her work challenged Hardin's pessimism, showed that tragedy is not inevitable, that the commons can be governed sustainably when appropriate institutions exist, and the key factors include clear boundaries defining who can use the resource, rules matched to local conditions, participation in rule-making by those affected, monitoring by accountable monitors, graduated sanctions for violations, conflict resolution mechanisms, and recognition of rights to organize by external authorities. The tragedy also applies to global commons, to resources that transcend local or national boundaries. And climate change is the paradigmatic example. The atmosphere is a global commons, and each nation benefits from emitting greenhouse gases, benefits from economic activity that produces emissions, while the costs of climate change are distributed globally, are borne by all nations. And this creates the tragedy structure, makes it individually rational for each nation to emit even when collective emissions drive catastrophic change. And solving this global tragedy requires international cooperation, requires agreements that bind nations to reduce emissions, requires mechanisms for enforcement and monitoring, and achieving such cooperation is extraordinarily difficult, requires overcoming free rider problems, requires building trust among nations with divergent interests, and the failure to adequately address climate change demonstrates the difficulty of solving tragedies at global scale, shows that the larger the commons and the more diverse the users, the harder it is to achieve collective governance. The tragedy also has temporal dimensions, affects intergenerational equity, because current overuse depletes resources for future generations, and future people cannot participate in current decisions, cannot bargain or negotiate, cannot protect their interests. And this creates an asymmetry where present benefits come at future costs, and market mechanisms and democratic processes are biased toward the present, give insufficient weight to future generations. And avoiding intergenerational tragedy requires institutional commitment to sustainability, requires valuing future welfare, requires resisting the temptation to consume resources now at the expense of those not yet born, and this is perhaps the deepest tragedy, that future people cannot defend themselves against present exploitation. The commons continues to degrade, the herders continue to add animals, the pasture becomes barren, and the tragedy unfolds, driven by rational individual decisions, driven by the misalignment of individual and collective interests, and every herder suffers, loses their livelihood, destroys what sustained them, and the tragedy remains one of the most important concepts in environmental and resource economics, remains a framework for understanding why shared resources are vulnerable, why voluntary restraint is insufficient, why institutions matter, and the tragedy applies to fisheries emptied, to aquifers drained, to forests cleared, to atmospheres polluted, and avoiding tragedy requires collective action, requires governance that aligns incentives, requires institutions that make sustainability individually rational. And without such institutions, the commons tends toward destruction, and the tragedy of the commons endures as a permanent warning about the limits of individual rationality, about the need for collective governance, and about the structural challenges in managing shared resources. Bradley's regress, why relations cannot connect anything, A philosopher named F.H. Bradley examines how relations work, examines how objects stand in relations to each other, how one thing is connected to another through relations like larger than, or next to, or causes, and Bradley discovers a problem, a regress that shows relations cannot do the work they are supposed to do, cannot actually connect objects. And the regress goes as follows. Suppose object A is related to object B by relation R, and now ask what connects A to R, what relates the object to the relation, and there must be another relation, call it R prime, that connects A to R, and now what connects A to R prime? There must be another relation R double prime, and the regress continues infinitely. Infinite relations needed to connect A to B through R, and the regress is vicious because each relation requires further relations to do its connecting work, and the connection never grounds, never actually occurs, and so relations do not relate, do not connect objects. And if relations cannot connect, then reality is not structured by relations, is not composed of objects standing in relations. And this is Bradley's regress, an argument against the reality of relations, an argument that shows relations are impossible, are self-defeating, and Bradley concludes that relations are unreal, are appearances rather than genuine features of reality. An ultimate reality is an undifferentiated whole, the absolute, where all apparent multiplicity and relationality dissolve into unity. Imagine two objects, a red ball and a blue ball, and the relation larger than connecting them. The red ball is larger than the blue ball, and ask how this relation connects the balls. How larger than relates the red ball to the blue ball, and there must be something that connects the red ball to the relation larger than, another relation R1, and something that connects R1 to the red ball, another relation R2, and infinite relations are needed, each requiring another relation to connect it, and the larger than relation never actually connects the balls, because the connection requires infinite intermediaries, infinite relations, and the regress shows that positing relations does not explain connection, does not explain how objects stand in relations, only pushes the question back infinitely. Bradley's regress challenges the common sense view that reality consists of objects and relations, challenges the idea that the world has relational structure, that things stand in relations to each other, and if Bradley is right, then relations are impossible, are not genuine features of reality, and the world does not have the structure we think it has, is not composed of separate objects standing in relations, but is somehow unified, is an undifferentiated whole, where separation and relation are illusions generated by thought. And this radical monism, this view that reality is one, follows from taking the regress seriously, from accepting that relations cannot relate and therefore do not exist. Visualize the regress as an infinite chain. A dash R dash B represents A related to B by R, but this structure is unstable, requires further relations R prime and R double prime to connect A to R and R to B. And these further relations require still more relations, and the chain extends infinitely in both directions. And the regress shows that relational structure is impossible, cannot ground, cannot explain how connection occurs, and Bradley uses this to argue for monism, for the view that reality is not many things related but is one thing appearing as many. One response to Bradley's regress denies that relations need relating, denies that the connection between object and relation requires a further relation, argues that relations just do relate, just do connect objects without needing intermediaries. And the regress assumes that relating requires a relation, but this assumption is false. Relations connect objects directly, intrinsically, by their nature, and no further relations are needed. And the regress does not start because the initial premise is rejected, and this response treats relating as primitive, as something relations do without explanation, without needing further entities to make them do it. Another response distinguishes between external and internal relations, argues that some relations are external, contingent, could be otherwise, and these might generate regress, but other relations are internal, necessary, grounded in the intrinsic properties of related objects, and internal relations do not require further relations to connect them because they are not separate entities but are grounded in the objects themselves, and the regress does not apply to internal relations. And while external relations might be problematic, internal relations are sufficient for much relational structure, are sufficient to ground many important connections. A third response appeals to non-relational theories, argues that what appear to be relations are really monadic properties of objects or are reducible to non-relational facts, and larger than is not a genuine relation, but is grounded in the intrinsic sizes of objects. The red ball has size S1, the blue ball has size S2, and S1 exceeds S2, and no relation is needed, no larger than exists independently, and relational facts reduce to non-relational facts about properties, and Bradley's regress is avoided by eliminating relations, replacing them with properties, and this nominalist response preserves structure without positing relations as genuine entities. Bradley's regress also appears in discussions of properties and instantiation, because instantiation is a relation between objects and properties, and the regress applies if object A instantiates property P through instantiation relation I. Then what relates A to I? Another instantiation relation, I prime, and regress ensues, and various solutions have been proposed. Some deny that instantiation is a relation, argue that objects just have properties without needing an instantiation relation to connect them, and others distinguish between types of instantiation, first-order instantiation between objects and properties, and second-order instantiation between instantiation and its relata, and argue that the regress terminates at some level, is not vicious. The regress has influenced debates about the nature of facts and propositions, because facts seem to be structured by relations, seem to involve objects standing in relations, and if relations generate regress, then facts are problematic. And some philosophers have abandoned facts, have argued that reality does not contain structured facts, but only objects and properties, and true propositions do not correspond to facts, but are made true by objects having properties, and Bradley's regress motivates this austere ontology, this rejection of facts, as genuine entities. The red ball sits next to the blue ball, related by spatial proximity, or appearing to be related, and Bradley's regress asks how this relation connects them. How next to does its connecting work? And the answer involves infinite regress, infinite relations, or involves denying that relations are real. And Bradley embraces the denial, accepts monism, accepts that reality is one undifferentiated whole. And modern philosophers mostly reject Bradley's conclusion, reject monism, but the regress remains a challenge, remains a puzzle about how relations work, how connection occurs, and various solutions exist, various ways of blocking the regress, but no consensus emerges. And Bradley's regress endures as a permanent challenge to relational metaphysics, a puzzle showing that the structure of reality, the way objects stand in relations, is more problematic than common sense suggests, and the regress continues, infinite relations chaining backward, and connection remains elusive. The waterfall, illusion, when staring at motion, makes stillness move. A person stands before a waterfall, watches the water cascade downward continuously, stares at the flowing water for several minutes, and then looks away, looks at the rocks beside the waterfall, and something strange happens. The rocks appear to move upward, appear to flow in the opposite direction from the water, even though the rocks are stationary, are not moving at all, and this upward motion is vivid, is compelling, lasts for several seconds before fading. And this is the waterfall illusion, also called the motion after effect, a phenomenon where prolonged viewing of motion in one direction causes stationary objects to appear to move in the opposite direction, and the illusion reveals something fundamental about how the visual system encodes motion. Reveals that motion perception involves opponent processes, involves neurons tuned to opposite directions that inhibit each other, and adaptation occurs. And when you stare at downward motion, the downward-tuned neurons adapt, become less responsive. And when you look at stationary objects, the balance between upward and downward motion signals is disrupted. The upward neurons are relatively more active than the adapted downward neurons, and this imbalance is interpreted as upward motion. And the waterfall illusion demonstrates neural adaptation, shows that perception is not a simple recording of stimulus properties, but involves active processing that can be modified by experience, that can create illusions when adaptation disrupts normal balance. Imagine the neural mechanism. Motion perception involves direction-selective neurons, neurons that respond to motion in specific directions, and for every direction there are neurons tuned to the opposite direction, and these opponent neurons inhibit each other, creating a balanced system. And when motion occurs in one direction, the corresponding neurons respond. Signal motion, and the opponent neurons are inhibited, remain quiet, and this balance signals the direction of motion. But when you stare at motion continuously, the responding neurons adapt, fire less strongly due to prolonged activation. And when motion stops, when you look at something stationary, both sets of neurons receive no motion signal, but the adapted neurons are less responsive than the non-adapted neurons, and this creates an imbalance. The non-adapted neurons are relatively more active, and this imbalance is interpreted as motion in their preferred direction, and the waterfall illusion occurs. You see motion where there is none. The waterfall illusion is not limited to waterfalls, can be produced by any prolonged viewing of continuous motion. Staring at rotating spirals produces rotation after effects. Staring at expanding patterns produces contraction after effects. Staring at leftward motion produces rightward after effects. And the phenomenon is robust, is easy to demonstrate, can be experienced by anyone willing to stare at motion for a minute or two, and neuroscientists have studied the illusion extensively, have identified the neural mechanisms, have shown that adaptation occurs in early visual cortex, in areas like V1 and MT that process motion, and the illusion provides a window into neural processing, provides evidence for opponent mechanisms, for adaptation, for the neural basis of motion perception. Visualize the waterfall illusion as revealing that perception is relative, is based on comparisons, and motion is detected not as absolute velocity, but as a difference between signals from direction-selective neurons, and adaptation shifts the baseline, changes what counts as balanced, and after adaptation, stillness looks like motion, because the adapted system interprets stillness as imbalance. And this relativity is a feature, not a bug, is how the system efficiently encodes information, maintains sensitivity across a wide range of motion speeds by adjusting its response properties through adaptation. And the waterfall illusion is a side effect, a case where adaptation produces illusion. But the mechanism is the same mechanism that normally allows accurate motion perception in varying conditions. The waterfall illusion also has implications for understanding consciousness and qualia, because the motion you perceive in the illusion is phenomenologically real, is indistinguishable from real motion in terms of subjective experience. You really see the rocks moving, really experience motion, and yet no motion occurred, no physical movement in the stimulus. And this shows that conscious experiences are neural states, are patterns of brain activity that can be triggered by stimulation or by adaptation or by hallucination, and the content of experience does not uniquely determine its cause. The same experience can arise from different sources, and this supports the view that consciousness is a brain process, that experiences are states of the neural system rather than properties of external objects. And the waterfall illusion makes this vivid, shows that motion experience can exist without motion in the world. One philosophical implication concerns the reliability of perception, because if adaptation can cause illusions, can make you see motion where there is none, then how can we trust perception? How can we rely on sensory experience as a source of knowledge? And the answer is that we trust perception in context. We recognize that under normal conditions, perception is reliable, and unusual conditions like prolonged staring at motion are unusual, create temporary disruptions, and we can identify these conditions, can recognize when perception is likely to be distorted, and the waterfall illusion is understood, is explained, is known to be illusory, and this knowledge itself comes from perception, from observing that rocks do not actually move, from comparing experience to reality, and perception self-corrects, is reliable overall, even when occasionally producing illusions. The waterfall illusion also connects to theories of neural coding, to understanding how the brain represents information, and the opponent process mechanism revealed by the illusion is found throughout sensory systems. In color vision, where opponent red, green, and blue-yellow mechanisms exist. In vestibular systems that signal head rotation through opponent mechanisms. And opponent coding is an efficient way to represent bipolar dimensions, dimensions that vary between opposite extremes, and motion direction is such a dimension, varies from leftward to rightward, or upward to downward, and using opponent neurons allows the system to signal direction efficiently. An adaptation is a natural consequence of this coding scheme, is how the system maintains sensitivity and adjusts to prevailing conditions. Another implication concerns the time course of perception, because the waterfall illusion has a specific temporal profile, lasts for several seconds after adaptation, and then fades, and this fading reflects recovery from adaptation, reflects the adapted neurons returning to their baseline responsiveness. And the time course reveals the dynamics of neural adaptation, reveals how quickly neurons adapt and how quickly they recover. And studying the waterfall illusion has provided quantitative data on adaptation rates, on recovery times, on the relationship between adaptation duration and after effect strength. And this data constrains models of visual processing, provides benchmarks that models must match. The person stands beside the waterfall, looks away at the cliff face, and the rocks rise, flow upward in apparent motion. And nothing moves, but the person's perception moves. Reflects the adapted state of motion detectors, reflects the neural imbalance created by prolonged viewing of downward flow. And the illusion fades and the rocks become still, and adaptation recovers, and balance is restored. And the waterfall illusion remains one of the most famous demonstrations in perceptual psychology, a phenomenon that reveals neural mechanisms, that shows adaptation, that illustrates opponent processes, that demonstrates the constructed nature of motion perception. And the illusion endures, simple to produce, robust in effect, profound in implication, showing that perception is not passive reception, but is active processing, is a system that adapts, that responds to its history, that can be fooled, but that normally works accurately. And the waterfall flows, and the rocks appear to rise, and the brain reveals its mechanisms through this beautiful, compelling illusion. Berry's paradox. Language allows us to describe numbers in various ways, and some descriptions are short while others are long, and this leads to a curious question posed by G.G. Berry and later popularized by Bertrand Russell. What is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? And the moment this question is asked, the paradox appears. The phrase itself, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, is a description, and counting the words reveals that it contains only 13 words, which means it describes a number in fewer than 20 words. But the number it describes is supposed to be the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and so a contradiction emerges. If such a number exists, then it has just been described in 13 words, which means it can be described in fewer than 20 words, which means it does not meet the criteria of being a number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and therefore it cannot be the number the phrase claims it is. And yet the phrase clearly picks out some specific number, and that number must exist somewhere in the infinite sequence of integers. The paradox reveals a deep tension between language and mathematics, between the finite tools of description and the infinite objects those tools attempt to capture, and it suggests that not all mathematical objects can be uniquely specified using the resources of natural language. Berry's paradox is closely related to Richard's paradox and other semantic paradoxes that arise when language tries to refer to itself or to its own limitations, and it played a role in early 20th century debates about the foundations of mathematics, particularly in discussions about definability and the limits of formal systems. Some logicians argue that the phrase "the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words" is simply ill-formed, that it does not successfully refer to any number at all because its definition is self-contradictory, much like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves fails to be a coherent set. Others suggest that the paradox arises from an ambiguity in what it means to describe a number, that descriptions exist within formal languages with specific rules, and that mixing informal natural language with formal mathematical definitions creates confusion. Alfred Tarski's work on truth and definability offers one way to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between levels of language, separating the language used to describe numbers from the meta-language used to describe descriptions, and showing that paradoxes like Berry's emerge when these levels are improperly conflated. The paradox also touches on questions about computability and algorithmic complexity, because if a number cannot be described in fewer than a certain number of words, it might also be incomputable or irreducibly complex, existing beyond the reach of any finite algorithm. Berry's paradox lingers as a reminder that language, for all its power, is not unlimited, that there are numbers and truths that slip through the gaps in description, that the map is not the territory and can never fully be, and that even something as seemingly concrete as a positive integer can become strange and elusive when definitions turn inward and try to grasp themselves. Buridan's ass: when perfect balance creates perfect paralysis. A donkey stands exactly halfway between two identical bales of hay, equidistant from both, and the donkey is hungry, equally attracted to both bales, and both bales are identical in size, quality, freshness, and appeal, and there is no reason to prefer one over the other, no difference that would make choosing one more rational than choosing the other. And according to the principle of sufficient reason, the idea that every choice must have a reason, that rational action requires a reason to prefer one option over alternatives. The donkey cannot choose because choosing either bale would be arbitrary, would be action without sufficient reason, and so the donkey stands paralyzed, unable to move toward either bale, and eventually starves to death despite being surrounded by food. And this is Buridan's ass, a thought experiment in medieval philosophy, named after Jean Buridan, though the paradox predates him, and it illustrates a problem with certain models of rational choice, shows that if rationality requires sufficient reason for every choice, then perfect symmetry creates paralysis, creates situations where rational action becomes impossible. Imagine the donkey's perspective, looking left at one bale, looking right at the other, evaluating, comparing, and finding them perfectly equal. No basis for preference, no reason to go left rather than right or right rather than left. And the principle of sufficient reason says that to act rationally, the donkey needs a reason, needs something that makes one option better. And in the absence of such a reason, the donkey should not act, should remain neutral, should not arbitrarily favour one identical option over another. And so the donkey stays in place, and the bales remain equidistant, and time passes, and hunger grows, but still no reason emerges to break the symmetry, and the donkey, committed to rational decision-making, committed to acting only when there is sufficient reason, cannot move, and the commitment to rationality becomes a death sentence. The paradox challenges the principle of sufficient reason, challenges the idea that rational action always requires a reason to prefer one option over alternatives. Because in situations of perfect symmetry, there is no such reason, and yet acting is better than not acting. Choosing either Balo is better than choosing neither, and survival requires breaking the symmetry. Somehow requires choosing arbitrarily, and if arbitrary choice is allowed, then the principle of sufficient reason is false, is not a requirement of rationality, and if arbitrary choice is not allowed, then rationality becomes self-defeating in symmetric situations, becomes a principle that prevents beneficial action, and neither option is attractive. Neither preserves our intuitions about what rationality requires. Visualize the situation as a balance, perfectly level, with equal weights on both sides, and the donkey as the fulcrum, unable to tip in either direction because the forces are equal. And tipping requires an imbalance, requires one side to outweigh the other, but no such imbalance exists, and so the balance remains level, and the donkey remains centered. And the metaphor captures the paralysis, the inability to move, when reasons are perfectly balanced, when no consideration favors one option over another. One response to the paradox is to deny that such perfect symmetry ever occurs in reality, to argue that there are always small differences, imperceptible perhaps, but sufficient to break ties. One bale is slightly closer or slightly greener, or catches the light differently. And even if these differences are too small to consciously notice, they provide sufficient reason for the unconscious decision-making processes that guide action, and so real donkeys never face perfect symmetry, never actually starve between identical bales, because nothing in nature is perfectly identical. And the paradox is a thought experiment that does not correspond to any actual situation. And while this may be true for physical objects, the paradox still applies to abstract choices, where perfect symmetry can be stipulated, and so the response avoids the real problem rather than solving it. Another response is to modify the principle of sufficient reason to allow arbitrary choice in symmetric situations, to say that rationality requires reasons to prefer one option over another when such reasons exist, but when options are genuinely equal, then arbitrary choice is rational, is indeed the only rational response. And in cases of perfect symmetry, choosing randomly is not irrational, but is the rational thing to do. And the donkey should flip a mental coin, should pick arbitrarily, should recognize that in the absence of reasons to distinguish between options, any choice is as good as any other, and making an arbitrary choice is better than making no choice. And this response preserves rationality while allowing action in symmetric cases. But it requires weakening the principle of sufficient reason, requires admitting that not all rational actions have reasons, that sometimes the rational thing is to act arbitrarily. A third response appeals to higher order considerations, argues that even when two options are equally good in terms of immediate outcomes, they may differ in terms of meta-level features, and the donkey should consider not just which bale to eat, but also principles of decision-making, and there are good reasons to have a policy of breaking ties somehow, perhaps always choosing the left option in symmetric cases, or always choosing randomly, and having such a policy provides sufficient reason to choose even when the options themselves provide no reason. And the donkey, who has adopted the policy of going left in symmetric situations, has a reason to go left. The reason is not that the left bale is better, but that the policy says to go left. And this preserves sufficient reason at a higher level while allowing action at the object level. But it raises questions about where the higher level policy comes from, whether adopting the policy itself requires sufficient reason, and whether we have just pushed the problem back one level without solving it. The paradox also connects to debates about free will and determinism, because if every choice requires a sufficient reason, a cause that explains why that choice was made rather than another, then in situations of perfect symmetry, no choice can be made. And yet humans and animals do make choices in such situations, do break ties, and this suggests that not all choices are determined by reasons, that there is some indeterminacy, some capacity for arbitrary choice, and libertarians about free will embrace this, argue that free will requires the ability to choose without sufficient determining reasons, requires that agents can tip the balance even when reasons are equal, but compatibilists and determinists argue that apparent symmetry is always broken by hidden factors, by unconscious preferences or random neural fluctuations, and what looks like arbitrary choice is actually determined by factors we do not consciously access. The paradox appears in practical contexts involving decision-making under uncertainty, where multiple options have equal expected value, and decision theory must specify what to do in such cases. And most theories say to choose randomly, to treat equal value options as interchangeable. And this is the rational response, but it requires abandoning the strong version of sufficient reason, requires accepting that rational choice sometimes is arbitrary choice, and this has implications for ethics and policy, for situations where multiple actions are equally good, where no moral consideration distinguishes between them. And in such cases, acting is better than paralysis, and any permissible action can be chosen without need for further justification. The donkey stands motionless, hunger gnawing, hay on both sides, and the commitment to sufficient reason becomes a trap, becomes a principle that prevents survival, and the paradox remains, challenging rationality, forcing recognition that reason has limits, that symmetry creates problems, that pure rationality cannot solve, that arbitrary choice, far from being irrational, is sometimes the only rational response. And Buridan's ass endures, starving between equal bales, a symbol of the perils of excessive rationality, of the dangers of demanding reasons when none exist. And the paradox persists as a reminder that action requires more than reason, requires the capacity to break ties, to choose when choices are equal, to act despite the absence of sufficient reason. And rational agents, whether donkeys or humans, must possess this capacity or risk paralysis, risk standing frozen while opportunities pass and the ass remains. Hypothetical but instructive, teaching that rationality is not just about having good reasons, but also about knowing when reasons run out and arbitrary choice must begin. The transfer principle. Paradox when powerlessness spreads like a virus. A philosopher constructs a principle about power and control, about what things are and are not within our ability to affect. And the principle seems obviously true, seems like basic logic about how powerlessness transfers. And the principle says that if you have no power over one fact and that fact entails another fact and you have no power over the entailment itself, then you have no power over the second fact either. Powerlessness transfers across entailment, spreads from premises to conclusions, and this transfer principle is the backbone of the consequence argument for incompatibilism, is what allows the argument to move from our powerlessness over the past and laws to our powerlessness over the present. And yet, compatibilists deny this principle, argue that it is false, that powerlessness does not always transfer, that you can have power over a fact even when that fact is entailed by facts you have no power over. And this creates a paradox, because the transfer principle seems undeniable, seems like it must be true, and yet if it is true, then compatibilism is false. And if it is false, then the consequence argument fails, and both options are difficult. Both require accepting something counterintuitive, and this is the transfer principle paradox. The puzzle about whether powerlessness transfers, whether the principle is a logical truth or contains hidden errors, and the paradox sits at the heart of the free will debate, determines whether incompatibilism or compatibilism wins. And no consensus has emerged. Philosophers remain divided, and the transfer principle stands as one of the most contested principles in metaphysics. a principle that seems obvious but whose truth determines fundamental questions about freedom and determinism. Imagine the transfer principle applied to a simple case. You have no power over the fact that there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and the Big Bang plus the laws of physics entail the current state of the universe, including your current action, and you have no power over the laws of physics, and you have no power over the entailment itself, over the fact that the Big Bang and laws entail your action. And so by the transfer principle, you have no power over your current action. Your action is not up to you, is not within your control, and if you have no power over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this reasoning seems airtight, seems like it must be correct, and yet compatibilists deny the conclusion, deny that determinism eliminates power, and so they must deny the transfer principle, must argue that power does not transfer in the way the principle claims. The transfer principle can be stated formally using symbols. If no one has power over P, and P entails Q, and no one has power over the entailment from P to Q, then no one has power over Q. And this seems like a valid rule of inference about power, seems like it should be uncontroversial, and yet compatibilists argue it contains a subtle error, a conflation of different senses of power, or an invalid inference structure, or an equivocation on what it means to have power over something. And these objections attempt to show that the transfer principle, despite its intuitive appeal, is actually false, and powerlessness does not always transfer. Visualize powerlessness as a property that might or might not spread from one fact to another, like a contagion that sometimes transmits and sometimes does not. And the transfer principle says the contagion always spreads across entailment, always passes from premises to conclusions. But compatibilists say transmission is blocked under certain conditions, say that the link between premises and conclusions does not preserve powerlessness in the way incompatibilists claim. And this disagreement is fundamental, shapes the entire free will debate, determines which arguments succeed and which fail. One compatibilist response to the transfer principle distinguishes between two kinds of power: the power to make something the case and the power to have made something the case, and argues that the transfer principle conflates these, that while you lack the power to have made the past different, you do have the power to make the present what it is, and the presence being entailed by the past does not eliminate your power over the present, does not make your action not up to you, and the transfer principle fails because it moves illegitimately from past-directed power to present-directed power, treats them as the same when they are different. And once the distinction is recognized, the principle's apparent validity disappears. Another compatibilist response argues that the transfer principle uses the wrong notion of power, defines power in terms of ability to falsify facts, ability to make false things that are true. And this notion of power is inappropriate, is not what matters for freedom. And the right notion of power is counterfactual power. Power such that, if you had chosen differently, then different things would have happened. And counterfactual power is not governed by the transfer principle, does not transfer from premises to conclusions in the way the principle claims. And so the principle fails as a constraint on freedom, fails to show that determinism eliminates the kind of power needed for responsibility. A third compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle for some inferences but denies it for others, argues that the principle is valid in some contexts but invalid in others, and the contexts where it fails are precisely the contexts involving agency and choice, contexts where the agent is part of the causal chain between past and present, and in these contexts the agent's involvement blocks transfer, prevents powerlessness from spreading from past to present. And the transfer principle is not a universal logical truth, but a context-sensitive inference rule that admits exceptions. Incompatibilists defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist objections are sophistical, involve verbal tricks and redefinitions that obscure the real issue, and the transfer principle is valid, is a genuine constraint on power. And if you have no power over the past and laws, then you have no power over anything entailed by them. And this includes your present actions. And so determinism eliminates power, eliminates control, and compatibilism is false. And the transfer principle stands as a cornerstone of incompatibilist arguments, a principle that compatibilists cannot successfully reject without abandoning common sense about how powerlessness works. The debate over the transfer principle has generated enormous technical literature, philosophers constructing formal versions of the principle in modal logic, testing it against various cases, proposing refinements and modifications, and no consensus has emerged, and the debate reveals deep disagreements about the nature of power, about what it means to have something be up to you, about whether power is a metaphysical notion or an epistemic notion. And these disagreements shape views about free will, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. The transfer principle also connects to debates about counterfactuals, about what would have happened if things had been different, because compatibilists often appeal to counterfactuals to explain power, say that you have power over your action because if you'd chosen differently, you would have acted differently. And incompatibilists respond that these counterfactuals do not show genuine power. Because the antecedent is impossible given determinism, you could not have chosen differently given the past and laws, and so the counterfactuals are vacuous, and compatibilist power is illusory, and the transfer principle makes this explicit, shows that compatibilist power is not real power because it is entailed by facts you have no power over. The principle stands at the center of the free will debate, determines whether the consequence argument succeeds, whether incompatibilism is established, whether determinism is compatible with freedom, and both sides have powerful arguments. Both can make their case seem compelling, and the stalemate persists, and perhaps this reflects something deep. Perhaps the transfer principle is one of those principles where our intuitions are divided, where different ways of thinking about power lead to different judgments, and no argument can establish the principle or refute it definitively, and we are left with competing perspectives, incompatibilist and compatibilist, each coherent internally, each unsatisfying to those who adopt the other, and the transfer principle paradox endures, a principle that seems both obviously true and demonstrably false, depending on how you think about power and control. And the paradox remains unresolved, remains central to debates about free will, and powerlessness spreads or does not spread, transfers or is blocked, and which answer is correct determines whether we are free, and the transfer principle stands, controversial and crucial, a principle whose truth or falsity shapes fundamental metaphysical questions about agency and determinism. The white crow paradox, when one exception destroys everything. The statement "all crows are black" is a universal generalization, claims that every member of a class has a certain property, and to confirm this hypothesis, we observe crows, find black ones, and each observation of a black crow provides some evidence that all crows are black. And as the observations accumulate, as we find hundreds or thousands of black crows and no non-black ones, our confidence grows. The hypothesis seems increasingly well supported, and this is standard inductive reasoning, generalizing from observed to unobserved cases, and yet there is an asymmetry, a striking difference between confirmation and refutation, because while confirming a universal generalization requires many observations, observing instance after instance, refuting it requires only one, requires finding a single counterexample, a single white crow, and this one observation destroys the hypothesis completely, shows definitively that not all crows are black, and this asymmetry between confirmation and refutation is sometimes called the white crow paradox, or the black swan problem, named for the discovery of black swans in Australia, which refuted the European belief that all swans are white, and the paradox highlights the logical asymmetry between universal and existential claims, between all and some, and raises questions about the rationality of holding universal beliefs based on limited evidence. Imagine searching for crows, observing thousands of them, recording their colours, finding only black crows, never seeing any crow that is not black, and based on this evidence concluding that all crows are black, and this inference seems reasonable, seems justified by the evidence, and yet it is logically vulnerable because it only takes one white crow, one single observation to prove the inference wrong, to show that despite thousands of confirming instances, the generalization was false. And this vulnerability is not unique to the crow hypothesis, but characterizes all universal generalizations, all claims of the form, all X are Y, and it raises the question of whether we should believe such generalizations at all, whether induction can ever justify universal claims, or whether we should limit ourselves to weaker claims, like all observed crows are black, or most crows are probably black, claims that cannot be refuted by a single counterexample. Visualize the logical space with confirmation as a gradual process, slowly accumulating evidence, moving toward but never reaching certainty, and refutation as instantaneous. A single observation that immediately establishes falsity, and this asymmetry is fundamental to the logic of universal and existential quantification, because to prove all crows are black requires checking every crow, which is impossible if there are infinitely many crows or even just too many to observe, while to prove some crows are not black requires finding only one. And so existential claims are verifiable but not falsifiable, can be proven true but not proven false, while universal claims are falsifiable but not verifiable, can be proven false but not proven true. And this asymmetry shapes scientific practice, shapes how we test theories, and Karl Popper built an entire philosophy of science around it, arguing that scientific theories should be universal claims that are falsifiable, that science progresses not by confirming theories, but by attempting to refute them, and theories that survive refutation attempts are corroborated though never confirmed. The white crow paradox connects to the problem of induction, to Hume's challenge, because induction moves from observed instances to unobserved generalizations, from particular to universal, and this move is never logically justified, can never guarantee that the conclusion is true even if all premises are true, and the possibility of a white crow, the possibility that the next observation will refute the generalization, is always present, can never be eliminated, no matter how many confirming instances we have observed. And this makes universal generalizations perpetually tentative, perpetually vulnerable. And some philosophers conclude that we should never fully believe them, should always maintain some doubt, should treat them as useful working hypotheses, rather than as established truths. The paradox also raises questions about the psychology of belief, about why we do believe universal generalizations despite their vulnerability, about why finding thousands of black crows leads us to believe that all crows are black, even though we know this belief could be refuted tomorrow by a single white crow. And the answer involves practical reasoning, involves the need to act and make decisions based on limited information, involves the fact that treating all crows as black, until proven otherwise, is useful, allows us to make predictions and navigate the world, and the cost of being wrong, of encountering a white crow, is usually low, does not justify the cognitive burden of maintaining constant skepticism, and so we believe universal generalizations not because they are logically justified, but because they're practically useful, because acting as if they are true works well enough most of the time. The asymmetry between confirmation and refutation has been used to argue for various methodological principles. Popper's falsificationism says scientists should focus on trying to refute theories rather than trying to confirm them, should design crucial experiments that could show theories wrong, should prefer theories that make bold predictions that could easily be falsified. And this methodology treats the asymmetry as central, builds scientific method around the ease of refutation compared to the difficulty of confirmation. Though critics argue that Popper's philosophy does not match actual scientific practice, that scientists do seek confirming evidence, do not merely attempt refutation, and that confirmation and refutation both play roles in science, are complementary rather than opposed. The white crow appears rare and shocking, and the hypothesis that all crows are black crumbles instantly. Years of observations rendered irrelevant by a single exception, and this dramatic reversal, this sudden collapse of belief, illustrates the fragility of universal generalizations, the precariousness of inductive inference, and the paradox is not that refutation is easy, but that we believe universal generalizations at all given how easily they can be refuted, given that we can never observe all instances, given that the next observation might always be the white crow that destroys our confidence. And yet we do believe, we do generalize, we do infer from observed to unobserved, because we must. Because thinking and acting require going beyond immediate experience, require making assumptions about regularity, about patterns continuing, about the unobserved resembling the observed, and the white crow paradox stands as a reminder that these assumptions are always vulnerable, always tentative, always subject to refutation by new evidence, and that science progresses not by establishing certainties but by proposing hypotheses that survive testing, that withstand attempts at refutation, that continue to work until they do not, and the search for white crows continues. The search for exceptions, for counterexamples, for anomalies that challenge generalizations, because finding them is how we learn, how we improve theories, how we discover that what we thought was universal is merely local, that what we thought was necessary is merely contingent, and the white crow paradox endures as a lesson about the limits of induction, about the asymmetry between proof and disproof, and about the tentative nature of all empirical knowledge. Cantor's paradox. Georg Cantor, the mathematician who revolutionized our understanding of infinity by developing set theory and demonstrating that infinite sets come in different sizes, encountered a paradox that threatened the foundations of his own creation. And this paradox asks a simple question that leads to contradiction. What is the cardinality of the set of all sets? What is the size of the collection that contains every possible set as a member? And Cantor's theorem, one of his most important results, states that for any set, the power set, the set of all subsets of that set, has strictly greater cardinality than the original set, meaning there is no one-to-one correspondence between a set and its power set. The power set is always larger, and this theorem applies to finite sets, where the power set of a set with n elements has 2 to the power n elements, and it applies to infinite sets as well. The power set of the natural numbers, which is the set of all subsets of natural numbers, has greater cardinality than the natural numbers themselves. It is uncountably infinite, while the natural numbers are merely countably infinite. The paradox emerges when we apply Cantor's theorem to the set of all sets, because if there is a set that contains every set as a member, including itself and all its subsets, then we can consider the power set of this universal set, the collection of all subsets of the set of all sets, and by Cantor's theorem this power set must have greater cardinality than the set of all sets. But every subset of the set of all sets is itself a set, and therefore must be a member of the set of all sets, because the set of all sets contains every set. And so, the power set is contained within the set of all sets. It cannot be larger, and yet Cantor's theorem says it must be larger, and this contradiction is Cantor's paradox, a proof that the set of all sets cannot exist, that naive set theory, which allows the formation of any collection that can be described, is inconsistent. The paradox is related to Russell's paradox, which also exposes contradictions in naive set theory by considering the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, and both paradoxes revealed that unrestricted set formation leads to contradictions. that not every collection can be a set, and that mathematics needed a more careful foundation, and this led to the development of axiomatic set theories, like Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which impose restrictions on what sets can be formed, typically by avoiding self-reference and by building sets up gradually from simpler sets using specified operations. And in these axiomatic systems, the set of all sets does not exist. The formation of such a set is not permitted by the axioms, and the paradox is avoided by denying the existence of the problematic collection. Cantor's paradox raises deep questions about the nature of infinity and totality, about whether there is a largest infinity, a biggest collection, and the paradox suggests that there is no largest cardinal number, that for any infinite size there is a larger infinite size obtained by taking the power set, and this hierarchy extends without bound. There is no top, no final level, no set that contains all sets, and this open-endedness is both mathematically fruitful, providing an endless source of new infinities to study, and philosophically troubling, suggesting that mathematical reality has no completion, no ultimate totality, no grand unified structure that encompasses everything. Some philosophers and logicians have proposed alternative set theories that handle totalities differently, class theories that distinguish between sets, which can be members of other collections, and proper classes, which are too large to be members. And in these theories, the collection of all sets is a proper class, not a set, and proper classes cannot be members of other classes. And this distinction blocks the formation of the power class of the class of all sets, preventing the contradiction, and category theory provides another framework where collections are organized into categories, and the totality of all sets forms a category, but not a set within any category. And these approaches allow mathematicians to talk about very large collections without generating contradictions. Cantor himself was deeply troubled by the paradoxes. He recognized that his set theory, which had seemed so clear and powerful, contained internal tensions, and he distinguished between consistent and inconsistent multiplicities, between collections that can coherently be treated as completed totalities and collections that resist such treatment, and the set of all sets, Cantor suggested, is an inconsistent multiplicity, an absolutely infinite collection that cannot be captured by any mathematical structure, and this distinction prefigures the later technical solutions, but leaves open philosophical questions about what it means for a collection to be too large to be a set, about whether size alone determines sethood, or whether other factors are involved. The paradox also connects to issues in the philosophy of mathematics about the existence and reality of mathematical objects. Because if the set of all sets cannot exist, if forming such a collection leads to contradiction, then what does this say about mathematical existence? Is existence in mathematics constrained by consistency, such that only consistent collections exist? Or is there some Platonic realm of mathematical objects that includes inconsistent or impossible collections? And if the former, then mathematics is more restrictive than it might have seemed. Not every describable collection corresponds to a real mathematical object. And if the latter, then mathematics must find ways to avoid reasoning about impossible objects, must develop formal systems that do not permit the formation of contradictory sets, even if such sets in some sense exist beyond the formal systems. Cantor's paradox remains central to the foundations of mathematics. It is one of the key examples that motivated the development of rigorous axiomatic set theory. It illustrates the dangers of unrestricted comprehension, the principle that any property defines a set, and it shows that even the most basic concepts, like the concept of a set or the concept of all, require careful handling to avoid contradiction. And the paradox endures as a reminder that infinity is subtle, that totality is elusive, that the attempt to capture everything in a single structure leads to collapse, and that mathematics must proceed carefully, must impose restrictions, must accept that not everything that can be described can be mathematically realized, and the set of all sets sits in liminal space, neither existing nor not existing, describable but not constructible, thinkable but not formalizable. And the paradox persists, a boundary marker that shows where set theory ends, where the axioms say no more, where the attempt to go beyond breaks down into contradiction. And Cantor's vision of a hierarchy of infinities, beautiful and profound, remains intact. But the pinnacle is missing. There is no largest set, no final infinity, no ultimate totality, only an endless ascent through larger and larger collections, each one surpassed by its power set. And the paradox ensures that the ascent never ends, that mathematics has no ceiling, no completion, and that infinity, for all its strangeness and power, remains forever beyond our capacity to fully encompass or exhaust. Yablo's paradox. In 1993, the philosopher Stephen Yablo introduced a paradox that seemed impossible, a self-referential contradiction that contains no self-reference at all, a loop without a loop. And this paradox has troubled logicians ever since because it challenges the assumption that all semantic paradoxes arise from statements referring to themselves. Imagine an infinite sequence of sentences, each one numbered, and each sentence says the same kind of thing. Sentence 1 says for all sentences after this one, at least one of them is false. Sentence 2 says for all sentences after this one, at least one of them is false. Sentence 3 says the same, and so on forever, each sentence making a claim about all the sentences that come after it, but never referring to itself or to any sentence that comes before. Now consider whether sentence 1 is true. If it is true, then at least one sentence after it must be false. So sentence 2 or 3 or some later sentence must be false. But sentence 2 makes the same claim as sentence 1, just shifted down the sequence. So if sentence 2 is false, then all sentences after it must be true. But sentence 3 says at least one sentence after it is false, which contradicts the idea that all sentences after sentence 2 are true, and so sentence 2 cannot be false. And the same reasoning applies to every sentence in the sequence. None of them can be false without contradiction, which means all of them must be true. But if all of them are true, then sentence 1's claim that at least one sentence after it is false must itself be false, and so we arrive at a contradiction without any sentence ever referring to itself. The paradox is startling because it was long believed that self-reference was the root of all semantic paradoxes, that statements like this sentence is false create problems precisely because they loop back on themselves. But Yablo's paradox suggests that infinite chains of reference can generate the same kind of contradiction, even when each individual sentence only points forward, never backward. Some philosophers argue that Yablo's paradox is secretly self-referential after all, that the infinite sequence as a whole refers to itself in some implicit way, or that each sentence indirectly refers to itself through the mediation of the sentences that follow. But others insist that the paradox is genuinely non-self-referential, that it reveals a new kind of logical pathology that cannot be explained by the old models. The paradox has deep implications for theories of truth, because if self-reference is not necessary for paradox, then many proposed solutions to the liar paradox and related problems must be reconsidered, and new strategies must be developed to handle infinite structures that generate contradiction through endless forward reference, rather than immediate loops. Some logicians suggest that the paradox arises because we are treating an infinite sequence of statements as if it were a completed whole, and that in a finite or constructive framework, the paradox would dissolve, while others embrace infinitary logic and try to develop formal systems that can accommodate Yablo's structure without collapsing into inconsistency. The paradox also connects to issues in recursion theory and computer science, where infinite loops and non-terminating processes can exhibit similar behavior, generating contradictions or undefined results, without any single step referring back to a previous one. Yablow's paradox stands as a reminder that infinity is strange, that logic stretched across endless sequences behaves in ways that defy intuition, and that the boundaries of coherent thought may be more fragile than we imagined, that even without the familiar twist of self-reference, language and logic can still tie themselves into knots from which there is no escape. Zeno's dichotomy paradox. To reach a destination, one must first travel half the distance, and before reaching that halfway point, one must first travel half of that. And before reaching that point, one must travel half again. And this process of halving continues infinitely, and so it seems that motion cannot even begin, for there is always another halfway point that must be reached first. And this is Zeno's dichotomy paradox, one of the earliest and most famous arguments against the possibility of motion and change. Imagine a runner who wishes to cross a stadium. Before reaching the far end, they must reach the midpoint. But before reaching the midpoint, they must reach the quarter point. And before that, the eighth point, and so on, dividing the distance into ever smaller intervals without end. And since there are infinitely many such intervals, the runner would have to complete infinitely many tasks. And how can anyone complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite amount of time? And yet runners do cross stadiums, people do move from place to place, and so something must be wrong with the argument. But what? Zeno devised this paradox in the 5th century BCE to defend the philosophy of his teacher Parmenides, who claimed that reality is a single, unchanging unity, and that plurality and motion are illusions. And the dichotomy paradox was meant to show that the very concept of motion leads to absurdity, that if space and time can be divided infinitely, then movement becomes impossible, and therefore our perception of motion must be mistaken. Aristotle responded by distinguishing between potential and actual infinity, arguing that while the distance can potentially be divided into infinitely many parts, the runner does not actually traverse each part individually. The runner simply crosses the distance as a continuous whole, and the infinite division is something we can imagine, but not something the runner must perform. The paradox remained troubling for centuries, until the development of calculus in the 17th century by Newton and Leibniz, which provided mathematical tools to handle infinite sums, and showed that an infinite series can converge to a finite value, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, and so on adds up to exactly 1. And so the runner crossing infinitely many intervals in finite time is not a contradiction, but a mathematical fact. The sum of the infinite series equals the total distance, and the sum of the corresponding time intervals equals the total time. Yet some philosophers argue that the mathematical solution does not fully dissolve the conceptual problem, that even if the infinite series converges, there is still something mysterious about how an infinite process can be completed, how something that has no end can nevertheless reach an end, and whether the smooth continuous motion we experience is truly composed of infinitely many discrete steps, or whether motion is fundamentally continuous and indivisible. The paradox also raises questions about the structure of space and time, whether they are infinitely divisible, or whether there is a smallest possible unit of distance or duration, a quantum of space or time beyond which further division is meaningless. And modern physics has explored such ideas through quantum mechanics and theories of space-time foam, where the smooth fabric of reality may break down at extremely small scales. Zeno's dichotomy forces confrontation with infinity, with the strange fact that between any 2 points lie infinitely many other points, that the finite contains the infinite, that the continuous emerges from, or perhaps is the discrete, and that motion, the most familiar and undeniable aspect of existence, rests on foundations that are anything but solid. The runner crosses the stadium, the arrow flies, the universe moves and changes, and yet Zeno's voice echoes across the millennia, asking how, asking whether what seems so obvious might be impossible, whether the world we experience is the world that actually is, and whether reason and perception can ever be reconciled when one says motion is real and the other says motion leads to paradox. Zubov's paradox, a thought experiment in personal identity, asks us to imagine a machine that can instantly create a perfect duplicate of a person, atom by atom, molecule by molecule, and the duplicate is placed in a different location, perhaps on Mars while the original remains on Earth, and both individuals emerge from the process with all the same memories, the same personality, the same sense of being the person who entered the machine. And now the question arises, which one is the real person? Which one continues the original stream of consciousness? And Zubov's paradox, presented by Arnold Zuboff, pushes this scenario further by asking what happens if the duplication process creates not just one copy, but many copies, perhaps millions, all scattered across the universe, all emerging simultaneously with the same memories and the same conviction that they are the original person. And the paradox is that if one copy preserves personal identity, then it seems that all copies should preserve it. But if all copies are the original person, then identity has become plural. One person has become many. And this seems to violate the transitivity and uniqueness of identity. The principle that identity is a one-to-one relation, that if A is identical to B and A is identical to C, then B must be identical to C. But if millions of copies all claim to be the original person and none has a privileged status, then they cannot all be numerically identical to each other. They are distinct individuals occupying different locations. And so, identity seems to have been destroyed or multiplied in ways that make no sense. The paradox challenges the intuition that psychological continuity is sufficient for personal identity. The view associated with John Locke and Derek Parfit that what makes a future person the same person as a present person is the continuity of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and other psychological characteristics. And this view seems plausible when considering ordinary cases of survival through time. The person who wakes up tomorrow is the same person who went to sleep tonight, because there is psychological continuity, but the duplication case shows that psychological continuity cannot be sufficient for identity because identity is one-to-one, while psychological continuity can be one-to-many. Multiple future individuals can all be psychologically continuous with a single past individual, and if we say that only one of them is the original person, then we need a criterion to distinguish that one from the others. And no such criterion seems available if all the copies are physically and psychologically identical. Zuboff's contribution is to emphasize the symmetry of the situation. When there are multiple copies and no physical or psychological differences between them, there is no non-arbitrary way to select one as the original, and the others as mere copies, and if we are forced to say that none of them is the original, that personal identity was destroyed by the duplication process, then we must accept that identity is incompatible with duplication, that what matters for survival is not just psychological continuity, but also the absence of competitors, the requirement that there be, at most, one future individual who is psychologically continuous with the present individual. And this requirement seems strange, seems to make identity depend on what happens to other people, on whether duplicates exist rather than on intrinsic facts about the individual's own physical and psychological continuity. The paradox connects to debates about what matters in survival. Parfit argued that identity is not what matters, that what we care about when we care about survival is not numerical identity, but psychological connectedness and continuity. And if these can be preserved and even multiplied, then we should regard that as a good thing, as a kind of proliferation of what matters, rather than a loss of identity. And Parfit bit the bullet, accepting that in duplication cases, the original person does not survive as a single individual, but survives in a broader sense as multiple individuals, each with equal claim to being a continuation of the original. And this view dissolves the paradox by rejecting the assumption that survival requires identity, but it strikes many people as counterintuitive, as a refusal to take seriously the distinctness of persons. The fact that I am one person, not many, and that survival means that I, this particular individual, continue to exist. Not that some psychologically similar individuals exist. Others have proposed that identity in duplication cases is vague or indeterminate, that there is no fact of the matter about which copy, if any, is the original, that identity admits of degrees or borderline cases, and this indeterminacy is not a sign of ignorance, but a feature of the metaphysics, a reflection of the fact that identity is a coarse-grained concept that breaks down in cases involving fission or duplication. And while this response accommodates the intuition that duplication creates a puzzle, it does so by accepting that some questions about identity have no determinate answers, and this itself is a controversial metaphysical commitment. Still others distinguish between survival and identity, arguing that survival is a looser relation than identity, that survival can occur without identity if there is sufficient continuity and connectedness, and that in duplication cases, all the copies survive, even though none is identical to the original. And this view preserves the one-to-one nature of identity, while allowing that what we care about, survival, can be a one-to-many relation, and it provides a framework for thinking about duplication that does not force us to choose between denying continuity matters or accepting the multiplication of identity. Zuboff's paradox also has implications for practical ethics, for questions about the permissibility of creating duplicates, about whether duplicating a person harms them or benefits them or does neither, about whether the duplicates have the same rights and responsibilities as the original, and about how to distribute resources or assign credit and blame when multiple individuals all have equal claim to being the continuation of a single person. And these questions have no obvious answers. They require rethinking fundamental assumptions about personhood, autonomy, and moral status. The duplication machine hums. The original person steps inside, and moments later, millions of copies emerge across the universe, each one waking with the conviction that they are the person who entered the machine, each one feeling the continuity of consciousness, the persistence of memory, the seamless transition from before to after. And yet, something has changed. Identity has fractured or multiplied or disappeared, and the paradox asks what has happened, what it means to survive when survival takes this form, and the answers do not come easily. They require choosing between intuitions that cannot all be preserved, between the importance of identity and the importance of continuity, between the uniqueness of persons and the possibility of multiplication. And Zuboff's paradox remains a powerful challenge to theories of personal identity, a thought experiment that exposes tensions and forces choices, and it endures as a puzzle that has no consensus solution, no answer that satisfies all intuitions, only a set of options, each with costs, each requiring the abandonment of something we thought was certain, and the copies live their lives, scattered across space, each believing themselves to be the original, and perhaps they are, or perhaps none of them are, or perhaps the question has no answer, and the paradox persists, unresolved, a permanent feature of the landscape of personal identity, a reminder that who we are, what it means to survive, what it means to be the same person over time, are questions that remain open, that resist final answers, and that become stranger and more perplexing the more carefully we examine them.